Korea, throughout the war, there was huge dysfunction, huge blue water between American strategists in Washington and the West generally through the United Nations and the ROK. The ROK, of course, believed that the United Nations was fighting to unify Korea. It wasn't. It was fighting to diminish the effect and negate the effect of an egregious invasion by North Korea, and then to rescue itself from a problem of its own making in the Second Korean War, which is the intervention by China.
Hello. Early in the morning of the 25th of June 1950, the Korean People's Army, the North Koreans, crossed the 38th parallel, and the Korean War had begun. It was a particularly brutal conflict, with up to 3 million civilian deaths, 1 million South Koreans, and 1.5 million North Korean troops left dead. But why did it begin? And why, after the near cataclysmic invasion had been repulsed, did the Americans overreach, thus bringing China into the war? Historian Rob Lyman joins to discuss this forgotten confrontation, one that began less than 5 years after the end of the Second World War. Rob is the author, along with former head of the British Army Richard Dannatt, of Korea, War Without End. Coming up, there is plenty of great subjects, including the Film Club, a double torture special with Zero Dark 30 and The Report. Damien Lewis joins to talk about the SAS in World War II. Gordon Carrera discusses the man who wanted to destroy the KGB, and plenty more. So please do share with friends and family. But in the meantime, it's me talking with Robert Lyman on the Korean War. Rob, great pleasure to have you on again. Thank you very much for joining me here to talk about your new book, Korea, War Without End. But thank you.
Well, I'm really pleased to come back to the pod. And I think the last one we did was it a War of Empires? Or it might have been
No, it was
Victory to Defeat.
Victory to Defeat.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. So this is my second turnout with General Lord Dannatt. So and it's been an exciting book to write, actually. I mean, to be really frank, we weren't entirely sure what we'd find when we started researching, but that's always a good place to be. We were determined to enter this cauldron, the Korean War cauldron, with an open mind. And we very, very quickly discovered that it's a very deeply contested piece of history. It's quite remarkable how contested it is. But look, the other thing that really surprised us was how many myths have arrived over the years, driven from the Korean War, and how many of them are just nonsense. So we've enjoyed. We thought we might start. We thought we might write a book talking about the British Army, the British experience, the Commonwealth experience in Korea. But actually, a much more interesting book for us was looking at the reasons for it happening, trying to understand all the things that went on that caused the war to come to fruition in the first place, what happened in broad terms strategically during the war, because it's absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, how it was brought to an end. And look, we spent a lot of our time during the writing of this book saying, gosh, isn't that like Ukraine? On one occasion, Richard said to me, gosh, Robert, it's a little bit like the Kim family running the war in Ukraine for the Russians. And then not very long, much longer after that, the Koreans started throwing their weight around in I think they've stopped it now, in Ukraine as well. It's quite
North Korean troops in Ukraine. Yes,
North Korean troops in Ukraine. I mean, who would have imagined it? Absolutely barking mad. But it's been a really, really fascinating book to write. I mean, all the books that we end up writing, are interesting. This has been really fascinating because we have been writing about a period of history. It ended 75 years ago, and or started 75 years ago rather, and yet so much of it is directly relevant to statecraft and the delivery of war today. And Ukraine is the perfect example.
Yes, indeed. But you write about this conflict in Korea, and it's a war that actually we should say is still ongoing.
Exactly.
And you say that it's in your introduction, it's a war that is both, well, it's certainly misunderstood, but also forgotten. I think you wander around a Waitrose in Bracknell asking people.
Yes. Well, this was
in the middle of their weekly shop.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't actually plan this at all, but
Yeah.
I was in Bracknell and I had my company ID badge around my neck, and I just stood. I thought I'll see if I can wing this, and I just stopped there and I asked 62 people. It only took about 20, 25 minutes on the high street in Bracknell whether they remembered. Sorry, if they knew what war was associated with the battles of Waterloo, Balaclava, the Somme, El Alamein, and the Imjin River. So just those five, and most people recognized Waterloo as being a war against the French. Most people recognized the Balaclava as being the Crimean War. Extraordinarily, actually, that I was quite surprised at that. Virtually everyone got the Somme as being in the First World War. Everyone got El Alamein, virtually everyone got El Alamein being in the Second World War. Um, no one not a single person got the Imjin River. I mean, many people thought it was the American Civil War. I had all sorts of crazy answers. And it was a bit of fun because I had a bit of time to spare. And I thought, why don't I just ask people? And yet, when you speak, we spoke to a number of Koreans, South Koreans actually, during the writing of the book. Some of them here, and some of them in South Korea.
You didn't get to North Korea then.
We didn't get to North Korea. I don't think Richard's status would allow him a visa to North Korea. But we can certainly keep on trying. But it was very interesting when you talk to Koreans, of course, and then you talk to the Chinese. I mean, it's absolutely in their DNA. Really, really extraordinary. And I did one symposium with a Korean, South Korean academic, and it's really amazing how, the war is such a fundamental part of their existence, and they live and breathe it every day. So we know, of course, the war has not ended because there's no peace agreement. There's just a cessation of hostilities and basically an agreement to not to continue fighting. There have been a few flare-ups over the years, but there hasn't been a determined policy of peace. And now that's really important to close off a war. Well, actually, is it? Because it's very interesting to see that the absence of war may well be all that is required. The absence of fighting may be all that is required because there hasn't been any flare-up of war between the two sides since 1953. And um, and one might ask why that's the case. Well, since you asked, I'm going to try and answer it. And I asked this question to a number of South Korean academics when I was writing the book, when we were writing the book, and again to a South Korean friend last weekend. And she replied and she said, well, it's because, very, very simply, we think it's because it's in Kim Il Sung, sorry, it's in the Kim family's interest, not Kim Il Sung anymore, to ensure that there is a vicious enemy on the doorsteps of North Korea. And that makes an enormous amount of sense, of course. If you are in the business of locking down your country and exercising repressive totalitarianism over your domestic people, over your people, then you're going to want to give them a reason for it. And of course, the existential threat, supposed existential threat in North Korea from South Korea is really important. Well, one of the first things we discovered when we were researching, Rich and I went away. We both had a whole bunch of books to read, and I started working on the official histories. There's some very good official histories. The American ones are absolutely brilliant. British ones much shorter and less so, but the American ones are very combat orientated, very operationally focused. British ones much more strategic. But there are 7 volumes, I think it is, of the South Korean, the Republic of Korea um, uh, official history, and that's absolutely remarkable because you get an incredibly important sense in the official, and certainly in the South Korean official history, of the importance of Japan in post 1950 security conceptions. Now, what has Japan got to do with any of this? It's because Japan was the colonial master from 1910 to 1945, and it made such a dramatic impact on Korean policy, Korean economics, Korean culture. I mean, they attempted to
Korea was one sort of
it
state.
was a united country. It was a united country. It had a very long history. It had a 1,000-year history, the Chosun Empire, and it was. remarkably, then when the country was remarkably united, homogenous, with a very strong culture, it was stamped out dramatically by the Japanese. And the North Koreans today regard the way they regard the South is as Japanese puppets, almost like uh, the South Koreans having or being party to the Stockholm syndrome. They've been captured intellectually by and mentally by the Japanese, and they're still prisoners of the Japanese. And this really comes out very strongly. And I'd never realized this before. And it's an important part of the context of the war. One of the reasons, possibly an excuse, but one of the reasons why the North Koreans regard the South to be the enemies, because they regard them to be residual puppets of a foreign or an alien regime. Now, I don't give that. That might be the case in terms of their argument. I don't actually believe it's true, of course, because there are. It's all too easy to see this as an excuse for an attempt by the North to apply their totalitarianism on the South. And if you're going to do that, you're going to use all sorts of arguments. But it's interesting to see how this idea has perpetuated over the decades. So when we were writing it, I mean, I think one of the concerns.
Just one question, Rob. Sorry to interrupt, because one thing that I was thinking is that, we're only 5 years after the conclusion of the Second World War.
Yeah,
Was another reason for the North Koreans, or maybe not a reason, but in their calculations, they just didn't expect the West, the Americans, the United Nations, the British to come in because it's
exactly,
5 years
exactly.
after the Second World War.
Well, it's not because they didn't expect them to come in because it was so close to the Second World War. You're absolutely right. Kim Il-sung, who designed the invasion of the South that began on the 25th of June, 1950, completely misapprehended the nature of the potential response of the United States. He had persuaded himself that the Americans wouldn't get involved in supporting the Republic of Korea. American troops had finally left Korea a few months prior, and he believed that there was no national interest that would bring the Americans back in support of the ROK, the Republic of Korea. Well, he got that absolutely badly wrong. And he got it badly wrong because, like most totalitarians, even though he'd only been there for 5 years in an increasingly totalitarian, locked down country, you stop listening to what's going on outside. You stop really understanding what's happening in the world outside your borders. And he failed to understand two things. First of all, he failed to understand the extent of the um, how would I describe this? The embarrassment of the West in failing to stand up to Hitler in 1938. Clement Attlee, the moment he heard about the invasion of South Korea by North Korea, basically said to himself, "Well, I do not want to be seen as a Tory appeaser. Britain will support any action the United States takes through the United Nations to reverse this egregious aggrandizement by the North Koreans." So that's the first thing that he failed to understand. He just did not understand how important, how totemic the failure at Munich had been for international relations. And one of the great consequences of Munich, of course, was the establishment of the United Nations. And the first principle of the United Nations, of course, as everyone knows, was the insistence that national sovereignty is sacrosanct. The only reason you can attack a neighbor is in self-defense. The United Nations conventions do not allow anyone to invade another country unless there's a very, very good reason to do it. You can't just do it for reasons that Kim Il-sung came up with in June 1950, which effectively made it illegal. And that's a really critical point. Kim Il-sung had no idea of the nature of the history behind the creation of the United Nations and of this fundamental principle. And it was this fundamental principle that ultimately brought 18 countries, including the United States, very, very quickly into the war on the side of the Republic of Korea, because the ROK were the victim. Very, very clear-cut case of aggressor and victim. And it's exactly the same in Russia, with Russia and Ukraine. It's absolutely the same issue. The only challenge the world has got is, of course, that Russia is a member of the Security Council. The other thing that he failed to understand, this is Kim Il Sung in 1950, is that the Republic of Korea only let the Americans go after the Americans had signed a collective security agreement with them. Now, this is also fundamental. So there are a couple of really important aspects to the way in which states now operate with each other that's fundamentally different to the way in which they operated before the Second World War. Before the Second World War, there were no really effective collective security agreements. After the Second World War, the world was built on them. The United Nations being, it's not a collective security agreement, but it's the principle I've already outlined. NATO was the first effective collective security agreement that bound the countries of Europe, the Western Europe, with the United States and Canada together, and insisted that if one country was attacked, the others would be obliged to jump in and help out. Now, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, had signed an agreement with the United States, which meant the United States was obligated to support the ROK. Now, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So for two very good reasons, it was always going to happen, always going to happen. The United States would support the ROK, whether they liked it or not. And the truth is, in 1950, America had disarmed to an alarming degree, and its army had reduced from an extraordinary high number in 1945 to a very, very small number in 1950. Men were joining the army for very different reasons. You know, who would have imagined there to be that America would have to go to war again so soon after 1945? We had entered a period of nirvana very, very similar to that which pertained to Britain after the First World War. And America was not ready militarily. There was even attempts after the Second World War to remove the Marine Corps from the order of battle, basically to dissolve it. And the equipment that the Americans had available were basically stockpiles of Second World War stuff. But mentally, they weren't ready for war. So, yeah, committing people to war was one thing. Having men available to fight and to fight effectively was another. Particularly in 1950, when, of course, Kim Il Sung launched his invasion, he had starter's advantage. If you have starter's advantage, you've always got the opportunity of scoring the first few goals, and that might be sufficient to win the game. And it was a very, very close run thing. When North Korea invaded, they made dramatic progress, captured Seoul very quickly, basically pushed the Republic of Korea army and a few American units called in to plug the gaps, push them aside very easily. And they very, very nearly captured the entirety of the peninsula.
Yeah, they get a long way south, don't they?
They come up right against the Pusan Peninsula, now Busan, and a series of very, very fierce fights were undertaken around the Pusan perimeter, all the way through July and September. And the North Koreans very, very nearly capture their objective. By this time, America's pouring troops into Pusan, as indeed Britain. And British troops are involved with the Americans in the slow fight back up the peninsula against the North Koreans. But it was a very, very close run thing. So the question is, if the North Koreans had captured Pusan and therefore the whole of the peninsula, would the Americans have continued the fight? In my view, they would have, but it would have been much more difficult for them. The whole picture in 1950 was turned around actually by General MacArthur, who is the supreme commander in Tokyo and had operational command in Korea, launching a very gutsy amphibious assault in Incheon, where he basically threw troops in a very difficult harbor, captured Incheon, the port at Seoul, and after some fierce fighting, captured Seoul and basically decapitated the North Korean army, which at that stage was south of Incheon. Really quite remarkable end.
Yeah, it's a most extraordinary amphibious landing,
It
which
is.
is also is it relevant to because we're constantly going to be thinking of China and that part of the world. Is it relevant to Taiwan in any
I think it
way?
is. I think it is. I think it was it was very interesting. I mean, never say no. After the Second World War, many theorists were saying, well, we're never going to have a D-Day again. You can't ever see that happening. We don't need amphibious capability again, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The United States Navy, through the planning for Incheon through September and October 1950, were dead against it. And actually most people were. It was only MacArthur's um, um, bloody mindedness and his insistence that enabled Incheon to take place. But I think, subsequent to Incheon, people actually realized that this operational golf club in the bag capabilities, to use that metaphor, was incredibly important because if the Americans didn't have the ability to launch an amphibious assault against Incheon or indeed the East Coast, that operational advantage would not have been available. The opportunity to entirely decapitate the North Korean assault offensive would have not been available. And by removing an amphibious capability from your golf bag capabilities would have been very extraordinarily stupid. And it's very interesting. Every single defense, and think about the United Kingdom, every defense review we ever have always asks the question, well, are we ever going to do this again? Well, I can guarantee we're going to do it again. And yet it's an easy capability to remove. It's a very hard capability to replace if you don't have it. Fortunately, the Americans have retained their amphibious capability ever since, and it's been used very effectively to move troops and equipment around sea lanes of communication in a large number of military operations ever since. But I mean, this is a really important point at which in the war, where Richard and I sort of got to the end of the Incheon landings, we looked at each other and said, well, why didn't the Americans just stop here? They had reached the point at which they had turned back the North Korean invasion, in fact, defeated the North Korean People's Army. There was nothing left of it. And they had achieved what they'd set out to do when they responded to the North Korea's invasion. And I think this is why we now, we've written in the book, we regard there to have been two Korean wars. The first war was that war between June and October 1950, where the North invaded, the South responded, the world responded on the South's behalf and stopped ended the invasion and defeated the North Koreans. There was a momentary pause where a period of unthinking took place. We didn't put that in the book, but that's the way sort of we describe it, a period of unthinking. How do you describe a period where you don't actually think as smartly as you ought to about what you're going to do next and what the consequences might be? And to cut the story short, what happened was in the twinkling of an eye, Washington agreed. This wasn't just MacArthur and Tokyo, but Washington and followed by MacArthur, authorized the occupation or the invasion of North Korea. So, in the background to all these military operations, the political context is a Republic of Korea, which is recognized by the United Nations, being run by or led by a political party run by a chap called Syngman Rhee. That's actually a pseudonym, but we'll stick with Syngman Rhee. And he's badgering all the way along that the purpose of this war shouldn't simply be to defeat the North Koreans, but it should be to unite the whole of the Korean Peninsula under the ROK, the country that has been recognized by the United Nations, and the North Koreans could be defeated and communism could be thrown out the door. Now that's all fair. It's all good and fair. I mean, it makes sense in some context. It makes sense in the context of there being no other potential threats to you in carrying out that invasion of North Korea. And the obvious threat, and a threat that was very it was made very clear to America, was that of Chinese intervention. Now, China, of course, was now communist. Mao had won the Civil War in October the previous year. He wasn't ready for a war. He didn't really approve of Kim Il-sung's invasion, and indeed nor did Stalin, as it turned out. So this wasn't really a war by the East against the West. This was a war designed by Kim Il-sung, and he thought he'd get away with it. And basically, Stalin and Mao both took the risk that he would get away with it, and he failed. But for the Americans launching an offensive into North Korea, not paying any attention whatsoever to the threat posed to that counteroffensive by the Chinese was an extraordinarily stupid thing to do, a very, very significant strategic failure. Um, Look, all of the arguments at the time when people were discussing it, and there weren't many. There were a couple of really important documents. They basically said, well, China's just been through a very, very long period of civil war. It hasn't been united since 1910. What on earth are they going to do? Well, well, we saw that in October 1950 when the Chinese responded very quickly, and that response, we had the first phase offensive in October. There were 5 separate offensives thereafter as the Chinese built up their forces all the way through to the following April, and very nearly destroyed the United Nations forces in Korea as a consequence. And it's at this point that I think the story really gets interesting. So we're into the Second Korean War. The Americans and the British and everyone else has been pushed back in some savage fighting. But very interestingly, the commander of the UN forces, Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo, loses confidence in the ability of his armies to defeat the Chinese and immediately urges escalation. Now, this is interesting for Rich and I because in all our military service, we were taught that the Korean War was a limited war, where both sides deliberately limited the fighting to the peninsula of Korea and underneath the threshold of nuclear use. And we realized in our research that this just wasn't true. Now, the first bit was true. Both sides decided to, determined to limit it to Korea. Both sides, well, the Chinese weren't going to fight the UN anywhere else, so it was going to happen on the peninsula because that's where the war began. But actually, there were very, very significant voices in the United States in particular, including MacArthur, who urged escalation. At the time, America had 369 atomic bombs.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. So that's his form of escalation is to go
nuclear, forward. Go fast.
Because China is of course not a nuclear power at this stage, is it?
China's not a nuclear power. Russia, or the Soviet Union rather, is, but none of these considerations made any sense to MacArthur. And it's in this transition between brilliant operational practitioner of war and not so brilliant strategist that we can see a really dramatic dysfunction in MacArthur. It's really quite extraordinary. And shocking, really. So his conception of war is that fighting requires battlefield victory, and it requires victory to be total, like the Second World War, where you're fighting for the unconditional surrender of your enemy. And he repeatedly made this point, both during his time when he was in command and thereafter when he was sacked. He kept on banging this particular drum. And he failed entirely to understand what war is about. Ultimately, war is not a game that should be left to soldiers, because war is an exercise of political will. And war involves fighting more or less, but it also requires a political determination to identify what victory is and what victory needs to be. And I think one of the most extraordinary things about this particular period of history was MacArthur blindly demanding that the enemy be destroyed with everything at America's disposal, including nuclear weapons. As it was, America launched, we argue, an entirely disproportionate attack on North Korea's cities and its industries and its people. From the air, the aerial bombardment, they basically took the lift and shifted the Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was again in charge in Korea.
I
The
was going to mention him, yes,
Yes, the area
because I
bomb.
mean, you have these highly. I guess I'm describing them as highly aggressive, in
Yes,
that they're probably a better description is highly escalatory commanders.
yes. Well, that's right, but it's again what's in your tool bag as a commander. Curtis LeMay had spent all the time up to the end of 1945, 1944 rather, believing, as American commanders did, in the virtues of precision bombing, without actually, and it was sorry, and it was only at the end of 1944 and the start of 1945 that he recognized that precision bombing did not work with the tools that the Americans had at the time. And the moment he transited from precision bombing, the concept of precision bombing, where maybe 4% of targets were destroyed with every bombing attack, to 40% of targets being destroyed in area attacks rather, did the whole policy of area bombing develop. Listeners will know, many listeners will know of the arguments between the British and the Americans in terms of what worked in respect of the bombing campaign. The British always said, well, precision bombing doesn't work. We need to bomb industries and communications junctions like railways and so on. And that might cause collateral damage. Our primary focus, of course, is destroying the enemy's ability to wage war, but you can't do it by precisely destroying individual sites. There, you can in some cases, Peenemünde being a good example, but actually area bombing became a fundamental part of the Allied defeat of Germany. And then from March 1945 became a fundamental part of the way in which the war was taken to the Japanese. And then in 1950, Curtis LeMay just picked up that policy, that he just lifted and shifted it. Very little thinking about it. There's very little communication in Washington about the right sort of policy to apply to North Korea. And all we had were targeting conversations, which says that these industries and these cities were important and these locations need to be bombed. And they were bombed with everything America had, basically B-29 bombers, able to carry huge quantities of high explosive. So you had this very, very rapid escalation to an aerial bombing campaign that ultimately kills anything between 16 and 20% of the entire population of North Korea. A fifth of the population. The only country that came near that in the Second World War was Poland. And it's an extraordinary volume. Now we of casualties, extraordinary proportion of a country's population. We try very hard not to moralize. We do introduce the idea of the just war and the way in which war is conducted, and we use Nigel Biggar's prescription in one of his books, where he describes the importance of proportionality. And I think that's a real challenge for the Korean War. I mean, consequent to the Korean War, lots of people who argue against the use of military force and the achievement of political objectives, largely but not exclusively on the left, use the Korean War as an example of what happens when you lose control of the military. And we think some of the arguments against the way in which the war was conducted are correct. There is no way that the West, for instance, or the United States or Britain would have considered an aerial bombing campaign of that nature in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else for that matter. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is technology. In 1950, the ability to target precisely didn't happen. In Vietnam, which is basically the second.
Well, I'm constantly thinking of Vietnam while
Yeah.
reading your book,
Well,
actually.
Korea, in our view, and we
Because I also wanted to. There must be. Is there a racial element here?
I don't think there is actually. It's funny. We talk
It's an
about
obvious question, though.
yes. I don't think there is. Or well, there is in the sense that Koreans were alien to American culture. But it's very interesting if you look at each of the contributing nations, each of the 18 nations, they all approach this issue. You know, how do we deal with the gooks as they call them? Actually, gooks comes from a term used in the Philippines. Interestingly enough, we had a little look to see where it came from. Um, and so ideas of overt racism, I don't think wash, but you have a very significant perception of there being an other. If you're an American serviceman and you're serving at the end of 1950 and you're being overwhelmed by large numbers of Mongolian hordes, and I say that because that was the phrase used, hordes. You know, have you been attacked by a horde today became a standing joke in Korea. But, you know, swamped by large numbers of Chinese and North Korean troops, a racial element must absolutely have been part of the equation. This is an alien culture, an alien people behaving in an alien way, um, and embarrassing you militarily, and as a consequence, um, leading you to be pejorative about them. Just going back to that Vietnam thing, I think linebacker, all the very, very significant B-52 attacks on North Vietnam saw their origin in Korea. Now, Richard and I deliberately, for lots of good reasons, well, one is the length of the book, it's 122,000 words. You know, it doesn't look much, but you think, you know, you can't really write much more than that. There is a chapter in our heads on Vietnam, but we deliberately left it out in order to be able to keep Korea encapsulated within the book. But anyone who understands the rise of violence in Vietnam can trace it very, very clearly to what the Americans were doing or not doing in Korea itself. So it's a very, very significant war in that respect. I just need also to add, it's fascinating how many sort of myths, you know, we'd look at each other and say, oh, I thought that X, Y, and Z were broken, you know, when we were writing this book. One was the idea that the new American century, Pax Americana, began in 1941 and reached its high point in 1944 and was uh, uh, solidified with the establishment of NATO in 1949 and so on. None of that is true because in 1945, America disarmed, and we were really surprised at the extent of that demobilization, that demilitarization. America really went back. Look, and the
Actually
parallels,
disbanding the US Marine Corps.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The parallels with Britain in 1918 and 1919 are really, or 1919, are really astonishing. America disarmed. America started withdrawing its bases from, it didn't have permanent bases, but wherever it was deployed in the world as a consequence of the Second World War, it was withdrawing back to the United States. America was turning back in on itself. The idea that America has bestrode the globe as an imperializing titan is a trope, frankly, of the left. It just is not true. America has always been dominated by its isolationist tendencies, and we saw this between 1945 and 1950. The the country wanted its boys back, and it got them back. But then what happens when a brush fire blows up in a distant part of the world, and you need to respond to it because you've got a defense treaty with Korea in this case? And America scrabbled around trying to rebuild itself. But as a consequence of the Korean War, through to 1953, America reasserted itself in the world and started uh, uh, rearming Europe through NATO, rebasing itself in Europe, and for the first time, permanently, perhaps not permanently, but until the present Trumpian era, had an outward focus, had a global focus that did not start in 1945. It was absent between 1945 and 1950. It started in 1950, and is still going until the present day. We have seen some significant signs that this might be reversed, but we need a reversal will take time. And I don't actually personally, changing the subject slightly, see there to be a complete reversal of American presence around the globe. We'll see a change or a shift, I think, in various spheres, a shift perhaps away from Europe towards the Far East and China. But we got a very, very clear sense through the writing of this book that Pax Americana began with the Korean War. Can I just say the other thing that really struck us as well? We sort of had a Damascene moment when we were thinking about this. The fighting in Korea and all these questions about how you actually end the North Korean invasion and how you bring the war to an end made us realize that the Korean War was the last great campaign of the Second World War. The war only happened because Uncle Joe Stalin, from August 1945, insisted when he occupied North Korea, the area above the 38th parallel, which was set out only and was designed only to disarm the Japanese and send them home. After which the Soviet troops should have returned home themselves, as the Americans did. Joe Stalin had different ideas, and he kept his troops there as part of the buffer, which he had established all the way around the Soviet Union. His ambition was to build a client state in North Korea that would do his bidding, and there were explosions of violence in various parts of those buffer states in the years between 1946 and 49, 1950, and every now and again they burst into flame again. In the 1950s and 60s with Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 and so on. But in 1950, this was exactly what a consequence exactly of what Joe Stalin had tried to do. And we think it's a good way of understanding the Korean War is that it's the last great action of that settling down of the world after the defeat of the Japanese and the defeat of the Germans. We don't make a big play of it, but if you're trying to sort of make sense of how the world is constructed and the end of one era and the start of another, we think the Korean War is much more part of the Second World War than part of the Cold War. And one of the things is, we're told constantly that this was a classic case of war in the Cold War. It wasn't. The Cold War was a war without hot wars. It was a war of escalation of diplomatic rhetoric, of diplomatic and rhetorical
proxy wars
right.
as well.
They were there. Yes, that's slightly different. See, this wasn't a proxy war.
No, I know. That's my point.
You are absolutely right. I think it's not a war.
China fights the United
Vietnam,
States,
for instance. Yeah. This is a very good example of how we've all come to think of the Korean War as being, an essential part of the Cold War, and it wasn't. It sits outside the Cold War. The Cold War saw an absence of war. Where war did take place, as you correctly say, they took place in proxy form, and that's why I think what we need to be very careful about what we inherit in terms of what we were taught and so on. It's made it helpful for politicians and historians in the past to say, well, Korea is part of the Cold War. It was a hotbed of the Cold War, but it's nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But it's a really fascinating war. I mean, if you just look at being parochial for a moment in terms of the British interest, it's really fascinating to see how effective British soldiers were in Korea, fighting with very poor equipment, most of it inherited from the Second World War. Many of the troops involved, a very significant proportion, didn't really want to be there. They were national servicemen.
Michael Caine was one of them, I think.
Michael Caine was one of them, yes. And also there were, that we created effectively a Commonwealth division. We started with the Commonwealth Brigade. First Brigade was a Commonwealth Brigade. Then we ended up with the 29th Commonwealth Division, which included troops from Australia and New Zealand, and it was phenomenally effective. I mean, the one of the things that Richard and I conclude is actually, and now this might sound a little bit strange, but it's the importance of battle. What do we mean by the importance of battle? Well, by that we mean that. Let me start it slightly differently. By March 1951, MacArthur had lost confidence in his armies to stop the Chinese. And because of that, he demanded escalation to nuclear weapons. But whilst he was banging on about this, his army commander in the field, Matthew B. Ridgway, quite a brilliant man. And for listeners who know of my interest in Bill Slim, I think he's the American Bill Slim. He is an extraordinarily capable man. He's one of my favorite American generals of all time. Matthew B. Ridgway reorganized his troops, gave them a specific focus, allowed them to withdraw in the face of the Fifth Chinese offensive, and then counterattacked because he knew that the Chinese were exhausted at the end of their tether, and he set out to establish a number of advances all the way back up to the Han River, recaptured Seoul, and re-established effectively a line of defense along the 38th parallel, proving that battle is important in regulating the strategic environment. Without successful battle, the only options, the only cards the Allies could then play was nuclear war. Now, this is a really fundamental point in our conceptions of strategy. If we think we're going to defend the United Kingdom because we've got a nuclear deterrent, we are on cloud cuckoo land because you have only one chance to use that. And that's when your conventional forces are exhausted and you've got nothing left in your kit bag. What do you want to do? Do you want to ensure that your conventional forces can continue fighting under the threshold of nuclear war? Of course you do. But we're taking a massive risk if we don't allow our Army, Navy, and Air Force, or however we decide to pull our troops together, our forces together, and use them in a sensible way. If we don't allow them to be properly equipped, trained, structured, and sustained in order to fight those wars to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. That's what conventional forces do. And Korea is a brilliant example of that happening. Without Matthew B. Ridgway brilliantly enabling his armies to fight, we would have had a nuclear war. There is no doubt about it. America throwing any of its 369 atomic bombs at China would have invoked a Soviet response. Now we know that we know now that Stalin didn't want to fight a nuclear war, but he would jolly well have done it had he needed to. So the world, came very, very close to nuclear Armageddon in 1951 as a consequence of very close to conventional military failure in Korea. So it's a war that we need to remember. It's a war that was largely unnecessary. The Second War for Korea was unnecessary because, in our view, America should have just stayed on the status quo ante bellum, i.e. the 38th parallel. There was no strategic reason to advance into North Korea except for this grandiose idea of uniting North and South together, and because that particular idea did not take account of the possible consequences of a Chinese intervention. It was unthinking, and that's really the thing that we come away with most. It's the most important thing here. If you are going to go to war, think very carefully about how you're going to execute it, and think very carefully about what victory means for you and how you're going to get out of it. In terms of Ukraine, it's really, really interesting to see this whole thing panning out in Ukraine. Putin very clearly does not want to withdraw at the moment. He's going to have to be forced to get to that position. And that's exactly where Mao was from July 1951 through to the death of Stalin in March 1953. Mao did not want to suffer the embarrassment of a withdrawal or a defeat or putting up the white flag or coming to a mutually acceptable conclusion to the war until he was forced to do it. And we look at the long years of the attritional campaign between July 1951 and 1953, and we say, what a waste that was. And it was a waste. But it was still necessary to persuade Mao Zedong, the leader of China, that he wasn't going to be able to unite North and South Korea together under communism. And so war has utility in that context. War is important to persuade the bad guy that he's not going to get away with what he wants. That message is the same message that the West needs to apply to Ukraine. And frankly, we have not been consistent enough in that message in supporting Ukraine to resist Russian aggression. And that's the basic parallel with Korea. Interestingly enough, just a final sort of point for me, Korea throughout the war, there was huge dysfunction, huge blue water between American strategists in Washington and the West generally through the United Nations and the ROK. The ROK, of course, believed that the United Nations was fighting to unify Korea. It wasn't. It was fighting to diminish the effect and negate the effect of an egregious invasion by North Korea, and then to rescue itself from a problem of its own making in the Second Korean War, which is the intervention by China.
Well, there are lots of contemporary lessons in this book, Rob. So this has been fantastic. Thank you. And the book has literally just come out.
Great fun to write it and great fun to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different levels. I could go on talking to you about this for hours and hours, particularly the Vietnamese connections to it, which happens only a decade later, really. Yeah. But Rob, thank you. And links are in the show notes for listeners.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Ollie.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.